All right. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I'm Maria Carpenter, and I'm welcoming you to the library's Meet the Author series. I wanted to start by thanking the members of the library's Programming and Communications Committee and all of our wonderful student employees for their hard work, and to the Northeastern School of Journalism and the bookstore for their co-sponsorship of this program. I hope that you'll help to support our Meet the Author series by becoming a library supporter today. We are also filming today's program to be broadcast on Northeastern's YouTube and iTunes University channels. Moreover, we appreciate your feedback, so please take the time to fill out your comment cards and return them to a library volunteer. I would like to introduce Stephen Burgard, Director of the Northeastern School of Journalism. Stephen is author of Hallowed Ground. He is also the editor of a new volume that has essays from leading experts in journalism, religion, and public affairs called Faith, Politics, and Press in Our Perilous Times. The book will be available this summer. Stephen will be introducing today's speaker, Dwayne Raymond.
Thanks, Mark.
You're welcome.
We're going to be passing the mic around here, so we ask your patience a little bit. I'm here not so much as an author today, but as a journalism person, and also somebody with a real deep connection to Provincetown, where our speaker lives and did his work with Norman Mailer. Let me tell you about him first, and then tell you some other things. Dwayne Raymond worked with Norman Mailer from April 2001 until Mailer's death in November 2007, and provided editorial assistance on Mailer's final 4 books. These were Modest Gifts, The Big Empty, The Castle in the Forest, and On God, An Uncommon Conversation. And Dwayne contributes regularly to the Huffington Post, which many of you are familiar with, of course, and has written for the New York Times, Brief Guide to Essential Knowledge, The Mirror, Newsweek, Newsweekly, and the Boston Reader. He was a writer and producer for NBC daytime news magazine show Real Life, and served as an associate producer for MTV's Real World Boston, and lives in Provincetown. And that's where I can add a little light here, and that is that my family is actually from Provincetown. My stepfather, John Snow, was the town moderator for many years. So a lot of what Dwayne has written about really resonates here. And when you read the book, you'll see there's a point where he talks about this landmark book of Mailer's called The Naked and the Dead. And reading about it as a young person, he was stunned by the 1950s era shocking nature of a title like that, which was so uncommon in those days. And I can remember being a teenager shortly after this period, and having Mailer around was a big deal. And I had a little shock of my own one evening when I was sound asleep, and my stepfather suddenly rattled my bunk bed and said, "Get up, get dressed, you got to come next door." Well, next door was a hotel called the Gifford House, which had a storied history, and at the time hosted a lot of social events and social parties and so forth. And he said, "Here's your chance, come next door and meet Norman Mailer." So I rolled over and decided to let that one pass. But as time went on, I got to know or see Mailer around town a lot, very much in the manner in which Dwayne describes him. There used to be a wonderful little pub in the east end of town, in the old, one of the old hotels there called the, I forgot, it's now escaping my name, but Rosie's. And you could go into Rosie's on any given night, and you might just see Mailer sitting at a table talking with locals. And I think if you read or hear from Dwayne, you'll see that this is right in keeping with his personality. And there's a great passage I want to just open with here in Dwayne's book, where he talks about when Mailer first came to Provincetown to work on The Naked and the Dead in his early 20s, he was not immune to the town's allures, which infects virtually everyone who sets foot on its shoreline. For Norman, that allure never diminished and indeed grew into passion, that part of him that commanded that he lived near the waters of Cape Cod was nurtured by each wave of season. He lived near the sea in other states periodically, and he certainly traveled the world, but he returned faithfully to Provincetown. And so as I read some Mailer literature, if you are familiar with this town, one of the great moments in his work is that there are some passages in Tough Guys Don't Dance, a novel in which Mailer describes the town of Provincetown. Now, I've lived there my whole life. My brother is actually a permanent resident, and I think I kind of know the lay of the land there. But I have never seen passages of writing of the quality of this on that town. You really get a sense of the brilliance of this author by reading that section. And so before I make our final introduction, I want to also mention in the same area of the book where we talked about Mailer's association with Provincetown, we learned that one of the things that Mailer asked Dwayne to do as his assistant was to drive him around the town on occasion, just sort of trolling to see what was going on. The relationship of this author with the town was not just of being a resident, but he was a witness to it. And the reason this passage is so absolutely stunning to me is that if you took the name of Norman Mailer out of that passage and put my stepfather, John Snow, the longtime town moderator, in, you'd see the same thing. That was what my stepfather loved to do. He would drive around and just see what was going on around the town. So it's a fascinating introduction, and with this link of this great author and journalism and the library for hosting, it's a wonderful moment. I want to introduce our friend, Dwayne Raymond. Dwayne. We'll have to wire you.
Are you going to wire me up? Okay. There we go. Hi, how are you guys? This is the first time I've spoken in a school. Usually I'm at a bookstore somewhere, but this is kind of fun. Can you guys hear me? Is that good and close enough? Okay. One of the things I was excited about with coming here was, in speaking to a younger crowd, a university crowd, was that I wanted to open up, through the lens of this book, I wanted to open up Norman's work to a younger generation. I didn't specifically write the books only for myself. I wanted to write a book that would enlighten, once again, his work and bring it to some new eyes, some younger eyes, which I think, unfortunately, in this time where we have so much instant information and there's so much out there, that sometimes print work, the works of these great authors, kind of get lost to the rush of always having to learn something new. And I think that Norman's work will resonate always. But I wanted to do my part to kind of bring it to light, if you will. And that's one of the main reasons I wrote this book. Another reason I wanted to do this book was to not have this time I had with him lost. And that wasn't just for a selfish reason. I realized after Norman had died that I had been in a completely unique position. His other assistant that he had for 26 years had passed on, and I really was the only person who worked closely with him and who was in the attic writing with him day in and day out for 1,000 days or more. And I realized after he passed that that was an exceedingly valuable experience to have, and I didn't want it lost not only for myself, but I wanted other people who have a fondness for journalism and writing to know what it was like to be in a room with a mind that worked as his did, which was incredibly and eclectically. And I think that writers often want to know, or people who are interested in writers want to know how writers worked. And so I've taken a little selection out of the book today. I was actually hoping that Stephen hadn't stolen that line, didn't cross over in there. What I'm going to read for you today, if you'll indulge me for about 15 minutes, is part of chapter 6, which is all about him beginning his work on Castle in the Forest, which was his final large novel about the youth of Adolf Hitler. A dark subject, but an important one. Norman was, as I said, an exceedingly inquisitive man. He wanted to know, from the time he was 9 years old, what could possibly have turned this child of a peasant family in Austria into this monster that changed the face of the world forever. And so he set about in 2001 to begin the book. I came to work with him actually in 2003, not 2001. I came to work with him in 2003, and he was just then beginning to delve into the serious writing of the book, or the serious study for the writing of the book. And we met in kind of an interesting way. I kind of left my life in Boston at 33 and moved to Provincetown to write full-time, so consequently I ended up being a waiter, and as usually is the case. And I was working in a cold night in April of 2000, I guess it was, when I first encountered him. He came walking into this little bistro I was working in. And we struck up a conversation, and we would see each other periodically over the next couple of years. And then in 2003, on April 1st, 2003 of all days, I went to the grocery store. I don't know why. I'd already been there. I had no reason to go there again. But there he was, perusing. There was this little man with 2 canes. He was 80. He was perusing this pile of bananas in a green bin. And even over bananas, he was inquisitive. He wanted that perfect bunch, that perfect bouquet. And he waved me over, and he said, "I'm working on a project, and I wonder if I could get you to come and talk to me tomorrow about maybe helping me, doing some research." I said, "Sure, why not? Of course." I mean, it was any writer's dream to go and work with this man. So I went over the next day, and we had a nice half an hour, 45-minute conversation, I guess it was, and I never left. We just had this amazing bond between us. And he loved the fact that I didn't care that he was Norman Mailer. I didn't. He was just Norman after that first few minutes. So we began working together, and what I'm going to read for you today is about his writing process, or as I observed it. And it's, as I said, from chapter 6 of my book, and it's titled "Building a Castle in the Forest." Although Norman had been preparing to put his Hitler novel to paper for the entire time I had been working with him, it was not until early 2005 that he resumed writing new text for Castle in the Forest. He completed the first 140 pages of an early version before I came to work with him, but he remained in research mode throughout our first year together. He'd done no actual writing of the book. He read voraciously, and I worked with him in the attic copying the files of books that held his notes in their margins. I spent hour after hour on the floor with growing stacks of file folders into which I sorted these copies and added to the tall bookcase near me that already bulged. The files expanded, as did Norman's knowledge about every aspect of Hitler's life. Each aspect of Hitler's life he planned to cover, and each character he wanted to paint into his tapestry. He would give me endless lists of subjects and names of people to research. The amount of books that came in the mail doubled, and I found myself putting together even more bookcases to hold them. This was not easy, because the attic was brimming, and we were running out of room. When Norman started writing, his already amazing concentration amplified. I was awed by his concern for every line and how it sounded to his ear as he wrote on clean white typing paper. I heard his shallow whisper repeating, changing tone, varying in strain, stressing, and subsequently slaughtering lines only to resuscitate them with droning repetition, all the while his hand thumped the edge of his desk to some music only he could hear. It reminded me of a poet finding the meter of a poem's inner medley. In his escalating deafness, there seemed to be an internal symphony booming, which he skillfully translated to paper. He'd always done the tap-tap to some degree when he wrote, but as he sank again into the novel, the practice became more pronounced. Some years before I worked with him, we bumped into each other on Commercial Street one sunny afternoon. He was taking his daily walk, and I was returning from the post office. We sat for a time on a bench near the library, and he asked me, as usual, if my writing was moving forward. He sensed I was lost, which was true, but he didn't spout the usual diatribe that many veteran writers flail at amateurs, which is, "You simply must do it," as if those empty words will present the magic bullet. Norman understood that what a novice writer encounters can be cavernous, and it's not to be toyed with. He'd been there himself, and he was never afraid to admit it. He instead urged me to take a look at my process and start there. "You need to speak it. Do you speak it? he asked me. I didn't know what he meant, and I said as much. Talk, he said. Read it to yourself aloud. There's a difference how words play to the mind from the page and how they sound when spoken. Do you talk when you write? I understood what he was asking me, and I did have a tendency to do that. But I had never known why, and I believed the act peculiar. I found reading aloud awkward because I have never much liked the sound of my own voice. I recall feeling that day as if we talked, like he had somehow spied on me. I was too ignorant to realize that he had great insight into what can trouble young writers, and he was coaching me. He was encouraging me. Yes, I admitted, I do that sometimes, but I think it's strange. Well, learn your rhythm. You need to organize the loud and the quiet, he said. The sounds are the muscle. Now, these years later, watching and listening to him write, I finally got what he'd been talking about. Norman had been telling me to find the right words, the right combination of consonant and vowel. Consonants, of course, are hard-clicking, slithering noises pampered by vowels that tend to slip around them like jelly. Words should flow from the page to the eye with infinite ease, or as harshly as the crack of your skull to a rock. Before Norman started writing the novel, he'd made endless notes on thousands of 3x5 cards. When I would read those notes, or other notes scribbled almost illegibly in the margins of his books, I figured out that, in part, he was defining what he did not want his book to be. Norman's novel about Hitler would have otherworldly intrigue embedded in it, passion and dirt and fiendish satire. Most writings about Adolf Hitler were barren and intellectual, or soured by the author's own revulsion at the subject. Who could blame them? Norman steered his work in a different direction than merely towards the sickness of what had gone on during the war. As I watched him do it, I was exposed to more lessons that I could ever hope to retain. As his stack of pages grew thicker, the obscurity and range of what Norman wanted to learn expanded. In the course of 2 years, I looked into the particulars of everything from Wagner to measles to Viennese blacksmith shops. I created files devoted to Jung, the brothers Grimm, Karl May, Mark Twain, flour mills, maps of Austria and Germany, silent films, wristwatches, rubber, pellet guns, painting, and early 20th century men's homeless shelters. The diversity of subjects was daunting and enthralling. I want to know about potatoes, he told me one afternoon over lunch. I've got Alois in his farm now, and he's tending to the garden. Alois was Hitler's father, and Norman was at the point of the novel where the family lived in Upper Austria near a small town called Hafeld. Herr Hitler was gardening, apparently growing potatoes, and raising bees. Norman thought I should study bees along with him, and of course I did. He literally submerged himself for weeks in countless texts about bees and beekeeping. I would give a list of titles to Judith, his secretary in Brooklyn, and days later, from the second-hand bookstores across the country came volumes about bees and the art of the apiarist. One of the finest and oldest was Maurice Maeterlinck's 1904 book, The Life of the Bee, which we both read and which Norman later gave to me. To elevate the study to another level, he pored over volumes that pictured the evolution of skeps and went so far as to weigh the virtues of cedar versus pine hive separators, just as his characters may have done. Norman made drawings of what Alois would have built for his bees and produced a 12-month timeline describing a colony's life from bustle to dormancy and back. I found sound clips on the internet that we listened to in the attic together. Norman was captivated by the frenzied dance he heard, the language of the bee. We listened for quite some time, both engrossed in the pulsations. I turned to look at him at one point, and his eyes were closed to better absorb the poetry of the hum. An expression of anxious stillness was engraved on his face. Clearly, he believed it most necessary to take this pause with the larger enterprise of writing his novel in order to better focus on the minutiae. He was writing the story of the most notorious monster the world had ever produced, but so much hinged on the dance and the song of honeybees. Norman said understanding the largely ignored details makes any idea authentic. Grains of sand ensure the mortar of bricks. Excuse me. Since the novel has been published, there have been countless references to Norman equating the rigid structure of bee society to what Hitler attempted to fashion for his unrealized utopia. He didn't actually intend that, no matter how obvious the illusion. He utilized the honeybees and castle in such a way as to illustrate the bond, or rather lack of one, between Adolf and his father. I know this because I asked him. I, too, had believed he was making the societal structure equation, but Norman set me straight, saying it was too obvious, too contrived. It just happens that Hitler's father did own bees, and as the two worked around them, their relationship began its decay. The true root of what Norman saw was as Hitler's drive for impossible order was the fact that Adolf never appreciated the beauty of the hives or embraced the hard work involved in maintaining the bee colony. This was disappointing to his father. If anything, Hitler would have ended up hating bees and shunning the beauty they embodied. As for Aloys's gardening and Norman's desire to know more about potatoes, I had a ready answer for him about that. Well, my grandfather grew potatoes, I told him. Oh, so this will be easy for you, Norman said with a hint of facetiousness. Why don't you type it up for me so when I get upstairs, I can read all about what you know? Well, how thorough do you want it, I asked him. From planting to table, he said, and don't forget variety. Is there much difference between a potato your grandfather planted and one from Austria, do you think? I have no idea, I said, and knowing it would irritate him, I added, I'll hit the internet. Norman mumbled something into his lunch as I left the room. Information, he was fond of saying, is only as worthwhile as the amount of sweat incurred in finding it. To his mind, specifics gathered with the instant ease of the internet could not be trusted. Stick to your memory and don't trust the computer, pal, he said as I headed off to my desk. If you need to back things up, then get to a book. You got it, I hollered back. I was placating him to some degree, of course. I couldn't remember all that much about my grandfather's potato patch, but I figured anything I'd forgotten would be fairly simple to find on a gardening website. My respect for Norman's ability to recall just about everything he'd ever learned through his life grew by the day, as did our familiarity with each other's strengths and weaknesses. I found myself amazed at his implacable craving for knowledge, even at 82 years old. He had lived more than twice as long as I had, but he regularly made me feel old now. Nonetheless, I embraced the method of my generation, and he embraced his. In our debate about getting information, I learned to appease him. Of course, he did the same by pretending not to notice. From that, strangely, came trust. I knew what Norman wanted, and I knew how to get it. And Norman knew that in the end, he'd get answers, even though he wasn't fond of how I got them. I would use books, but sometimes only as support to more immediate information from either my head or the computer. For me, the computer was invaluable, but not just because of its convenience. Norman forever attached a rush order to every thought that went into his head. He hated waiting for anything. While he loathed the computer, necessity dictated that he use one to provide him with what he wanted quickly. There was simply no way around it. I found a happy medium by keeping my online research a half secret or disguising it. I'd note the reference it came from and put that at the top of the page in bold type so he'd be sure to see from the Library of Congress or some such thing along those lines. It usually worked. I'd leave out any mention of internet sites because he would doubt their validity immediately and irrationally. I knew enough to thoroughly corroborate all source materials, and he was just going to have to trust me about that. On the other hand, if I spent an hour poring over a fat book, he'd grow fidgety about how long it was taking and constantly interrupt me, thus prolonging the job even more, which annoyed us both. The one thing I had on my side was that I could move about the house quickly, and he couldn't. I'd dash up the stairs and work at my own pace with my computer somewhere in a corner. This strategy kept me safe for about a year. Then Norris bought him a cell phone. Armed with a piece of technology that he had dubbed useless and detrimental to humanity, he discovered one fine use for it. He could call me from anywhere. How's it coming? He'd call and ask me from the second office, which is what we called his downstairs bathroom, or during a pause in his afternoon walk out on the deck. More than once I considered hiding his phone so I could get the work done without interruption, but I never did it. I typed up what I knew about potatoes, and then I called Judith down in Brooklyn. Although most of her work revolved around typing up Norman's transcriptions, she was an invaluable resource on just about any subject, and she didn't need to consult the internet or a book. Judith just knew stuff. When I mentioned potatoes, she blurted, "Well, you do know that potatoes first came to Germany in 1588, don't you?" I did not, nor could I imagine how anyone outside of the International Potato Council could know this, but Judith did, and it was, frankly, freakish. Then she told me there were over 4,000 varieties, and almost every culture first believed them to be pure poison and cause for every malady from the common cold to insanity. "What's he up to with potatoes?" she asked me. "Alois," I said. "Norman has him planting a garden. He wants to know all about them." "Well, you should give him what Nietzsche said, too," Judith said. "God knows he can't get enough Nietzsche." I had no idea what she was talking about. 2 minutes later, the quote showed up in an email. "A diet that consists predominantly of potatoes leads to the use of liquor." Suddenly, Nietzsche was funny. I put it at the top of the potato research. "Where did you find this?" Norman asked. Norman was as educated as any man could be about Nietzsche, but the line took him by surprise. "Judith," I confessed, "it was in her head." "Is there anything that woman doesn't know?" he mumbled, while slashing a red X through the quote. Unnecessary notes were distracting for him because he was inclined to become fixated easily on just about anything. Consequently, when he crossed something out from a page, it vanished completely. Norman constructed his story around the simple peasant Hitler family. And in time, he began to trust me enough to tell me where he might ultimately take the story, breaking his rule of never discussing the possibilities of where a novel was going. I realized he had no precise route when it came to the outline of his book. He hated plot, of course, and was on record as saying so, but there is a measure of direction any story requires, and that seemed, at times, to be as absent in him as any lesser writer. Hence, he was open to options, generally his own wildly changeable ones, as to course, but he was open to options. He made notes on cards with snippets of ideas or quotes to thrust the story forward, but he really wasn't positive about anything until it flowed from his pen. From what I could tell when he'd hand me pages to fax to Judith for typing, it surprised him as much as us what was on them. Sometimes he was categorically excited about the day's work, and sometimes he wasn't. He would hand pages to me and say, "Well, let's see how this looks typed up." When he told me he was taking his narrator to Russia for a long chapter to study, I had the sinking feeling that the Hitler story would swerve wildly off course and perhaps never return to Austria. He'd famously done something similar with Harlot's Ghost, an exceedingly long novel I admittedly have yet to finish. He began to pore over material related to the Romanovs, Rasputin, and Russia, and I wasn't clear what he was up to. Finally, after getting a call from a mildly irritated Judith wherein she asked, "What the hell am I typing every day? Where is Adolf? Why are we rummaging through the Romanovs?" I decided I'd find out. Norman explained to me that even the devil must endure lessons, and since DT, his devil narrator, was only a medium-ranked minion, the maestro, the actual devil, sends him off to Russia to learn the art of proliferating pain and suffering. The horror that Norman chose to illustrate his narrator learned was the trampling deaths of thousands during the young Tsar's coronation. When Norman explained this to me, I began to understand his logic. The idea was elegant in a sick sort of way, and I read his new pages eagerly. Norman had crossed into a shadowy, mesmerizing land of mysticism and the inexplicable. I mentioned it to Norris that the novel was shaping up as something the reviewers were going to describe as Norman Mailer meets Anne Rice. "Oh, God, don't say that to him," she said. "He won't like it at all. Norman hasn't liked a modern novel in years, and being compared to Anne Rice will drive him crazy." She was right, of course. No one knew Norman's literary quirks better than she did. Norman would have hated the association, but the truth remained that he'd created a devil that had a sense of humor, high intelligence, obvious human faults, and a restless conscience. DT was a lot like Norman Mailer. That's it.
So I think we have some time for questions. Is that right, Susan?
If anyone has a question?
And if you just repeat the question.
Sure. Yeah. Anyone? First off, who's ever read any of Norman's work in the room? Anyone? Oh, good. Good. Yeah.
I guess I'll start
Okay.
just with a more basic, fact-based question. But how much time would you spend a day with them or in the same house as them?
How much time would I spend with him every day? I usually arrive anywhere between 10 and 11. We never had set rules. That was the thing about him. He didn't like conformity. He didn't like structure. You know, he liked things to be sort of loose. He didn't like having me or Mike Lennon or anyone else knock on the door. It was always just come in. So I get there between 10:30, somewhere around then, 11. And then I'd work with him till about 5 or 5:30 every day. And halfway through my day, I'd knock off the research stuff, and then I'd go out and I'd do the shopping for that night's dinner because food to him was amazing. He thought as much about food as he did about man's existence in the world. And he loved the fact that when he found me in the grocery store that day, he deduced by what I had in my little handbasket that evening that he could also finagle himself a cook. And he was right. I love to cook. And so they had this beautiful house and a beautiful kitchen, so it was a dream. So it broke the work up. But we'd also incorporate food into the actual work. For instance, in the part I was reading there about the Russia section of Castle in the Forest, he decided he wanted to tackle borscht. He wanted to know what the peasants would have eaten. And he had had borscht when he was in Russia researching Oswald's tale. And he had this memory of it. So for 3 weeks, I tried to capture his memory of borscht. So we just kept having borscht over and over until I finally nailed it. And the secret, it turns out, was roasted bones. So anyway.
Let me ask you a two-part
Sure.
question. One, the Russia anecdote makes me wonder, did he know where a novel was going, or did he let the story take him there? And the second part, we hear a lot about rewriting as being a staple of most top writers. How much rewriting did he do?
He rewrote constantly. First off, yeah, he did know where it was going. And he had, I mean, every writer has an outline in their head, but it would wildly change. I think he fell in love with reading all about the Romanovs, and so I think he stretched that section of Castle in the Forest out to almost 250 pages, which was wildly frustrating for all of us who really wanted to know what was going on with Adolf Hitler. But after a fashion, he finally did cut it down to I don't mean this in the wrong way, a manageable length, and it remains in the book, and it's a great section of the book. As far as rewriting, yes, Norman's favorite four-letter word was edit. He would definitely do maybe 6 to 8 to 10 drafts of every chapter of everything over and over, and I'd watch him and how he would skillfully just chip away like a sculptor until he had this brilliant, rock-hard, thorough, unique sentence. And any of you who are journalism students or writers, that's the key right there. That's where the fun lies. That's where the joy is that editing. Because you've already got the structure, you know. You get to chip away at it more. Hi.
Hi. I've never read any of these books. What do you think is a good starting point?
You know, if you haven't read any of his books, a good place to start. I would pick up probably one of two books. The Naked and the Dead, of course, is his sort of the amazing book that came out of World War II. Okay. He was in the war, not for terribly long, but he was in the South Pacific. And the book he wrote was I guess you'd say it was the seminal book of the time, chronicling the war. That and From Here to Eternity, probably, those two came out. But the other book I'd recommend for you to read, though, it's just because I particularly love it, is The Gospel According to the Son, where he actually takes on the persona of Jesus Christ and rewrites the New Testament like he thought it should have been written, so we can understand it. Because if you think about it, it's a convoluted tale about what happened with Christ all those years, but he humanizes him, and it was a wonderful little book. Hi.
Hi. Sorry, can you repeat the title of the second book?
The Gospel According to the Son.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it came out in 1997, and it's a wonderful little book. I was actually reading it the night he walked into the restaurant, another case of irony, you know. Hi.
Your own process, did you keep an extensive journal during this time, or did you kind of recollect everything after you had
It was a combination of both. I mean, as far as he's asking me about my process of writing this book, I did keep extensive journals, but I didn't keep them with the thought of ever really writing a book. I just have always journaled. One of those quirky people that writes things down. Of course, after he died and after I was asked to do the book, I realized I had a treasure trove of material. And I'd also had, strangely enough, I had audio recordings of him. And just him and me in conversation. Because we would sit down to do the mail, and often that involved doing him dictating into a tape, and then I would type up the letters. But he, as I mentioned in this piece, he could be wildly distracted. So he'd start dictating a letter, he'd finish the letter, and then he'd say, that reminds me of something. And he'd sit there and tell me this long story, and we'd have a conversation. And I realized the tape was still running, and I had 45 minutes of a conversation on there. For instance, the Gore Vidal story that's in the book is verbatim. But I did have the fortune to be around him so much and for so long that the patter of his voice in my head was easy to capture and put on paper. So that helped too. But no, the journals really helped quite a lot. It's good. Hi.
What were your observations about him as a husband and a father?
Wonderful. I mean, listen, a lot of the stuff that's out there about Norman, I don't know if you guys know this, he was considered to be rather sort of bombastic, misogynistic, homophobic, if you will. All of that was not true. I mean, there probably was a period in his life where he was, to some degree, some of those things. But I met the man when he was 80 and I was just about 40. And he was, you know, to steal Tom Wolfe's line, he was a man in full at that point. He was 80 years old. Nothing pleased him more than being with his wife, one of his 9 children, or all of them. Luckily, sometimes they were all there. A great meal, and his work. That's what thrilled him. And as far as the homophobia and the disliking of women and all of that, absolutely not true. He loved women. He didn't like fools. He didn't care what their sex was. He was clear about. But he loved intelligent women. He had 5 daughters. So, you know, he was quite the man. And he was a great father. I mean, he went to such an extent to his children to do what he could for them. He was a really good man in that regard. And that's why I also wanted to bring out in this book, too, is that I wanted to show that other side of him, that side that I knew personally. You know, the side that Steve talked about when he ran into him in town. You know, this very nice, pleasant gentleman who just also happened to be one of the most renowned writers the world has ever produced. He was just this real nice man. So, anyone else? Hi.
I mean, as you look back over his career from Naked and Dead on, how do you reconcile the sort of machismo and the swagger and the things that are so present in his writing with the man in the movie?
How do I recognize?
Do you see like what he was?
Yeah, sure.
You know, that,
I think it's
evolution?
I think it's the same thing as if we look at ourselves. I know I'm not the same person I was when I was 20, you know, and his just happened to play out in public. You know, a certain incident in his life that of you know, atrocious domestic violence, granted it was terrible, followed him for the rest of his life only because he was famous. But normally, if it had happened to any other man, domestic squabble where one person gets injured or whatever, it would have ended up on page 32 of the New York Times, not page 1, not to mention the front page of every American newspaper in the country. So, you know, that can alter a man, I think. It can change him. When you always have that dogging you, that mistake, a mistake made out of, you know, youthful drunkenness. Who hasn't been there? We're just not wildly famous, you know. But I think his work evolved better because of all that controversy. And he was not a stupid man. He used it to his own advantage, too. So, hi.
I was wondering if you got to meet Norris, and I know that she's coming out with
Did I get to meet Norris? Well, Norris is like my sister. Yeah, in fact, I spoke to her this morning. Actually, no, it was yesterday morning. Yeah, her book is coming out. It's a wonderful book, and it's called A Ticket to the Circus. And our books actually make really lovely bookends for each other, to use a pun phrase. She chronicles the beginning of their life, and I chronicle that ending part of his life with the man that I understood him to be. And I really spent more time with him than just about anyone else, including her, because she was down in Brooklyn often taking care of her own mother, who was elderly. So I was in that house with him more than just about anyone. So I kind of speak from authority. So those 2 books really work well together. In fact, in today's, or tomorrow's Phoenix, when it comes out, the 2 books are reviewed together, which is kind of pleasant. And Norris and I will actually be doing a few events together in the spring and summer. So, are we good? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And I hope you check out the book, too. Thanks. Thanks so much.
Support our author by purchasing it. And thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you all very much.